Hey there, this is Dr. Bird. It's time for story time, Dr. Bird. Lost power at home, so I'm in a public library today, so I might be a little bit quieter than I normally am. Don't want to scare people. Have to keep my laughter down a little bit, I think, today. Um, so, yeah. So before we get started, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been here with me, present in live time and watching later. I appreciate the fact that there's so many people interested in what I'm doing here. So thank you for your interest. And if you're interested in supporting me as an independent scholar, there are several ways you can do that. I'm just going to mention it very briefly and then get on with the content. You can share a link of one of these videos with someone that you think might be interested. So spread the word, spread the love, if you will. You can subscribe to my channel, my YouTube channel. You can support me on Patreon. Biblical Bird is my name, and there's a range of $3 to $150 a month. Anything to say you appreciate the work I'm doing as an independent scholar is very much appreciated. You could also purchase the Audible version of my second book, Permission Granted. I did the reading for that, and that's a version of my book that I actually get some income from. So just putting that out there. And so now let's get into what you're here for, which is story time. And I left my Bible at home as I left in a hurry to get somewhere because I had to do an online meeting without power at home. So I'm gonna have to manage with an online version. Makes me a little bit sad. It'll probably go a little smoother though. So we'll see how this goes. So today we're looking more at Joseph and his story. And I put in the description for today's video, I put in kind of some content that I haven't done a whole lot of reading in terms of what other scholars are saying about this issue. So this is much more of a bit of a gut instinct on my part, and coming from what reading I have done as a biblical scholar in terms of secondary scholarship. So this is more, this doesn't feel like something I could publish, but I'm making the comments. Okay. So I'm fascinated by the fact that Joseph's story starts in what chapter? 39, 40, and it goes mostly through the end of Genesis. So it's at least 10 chapters of Genesis. And when you think about the fact that Genesis is 50 chapters, Abraham's story doesn't start until chapter 12. Okay. So Abraham is important up through at least the first, chapter 22, 24 is where we start hearing about Rebecca and Isaac, right? So, okay. So we have 26 chapters after Abraham is important. That's 3. And we have Isaac and Rebecca don't get a whole lot of airtime, interesting in and of itself. And then we have Jacob and all of his meanderings and wanderings. And then Joseph. So one of the great-grandchildren of Abraham gets this massive amount of content. I think this is fascinating. I also think it's fascinating because we don't hear a whole lot about him, at least not in the traditions I've ever been a part of as in Christian communities, right? And it's a good, 20% of the content of Genesis is Joseph and his story. I find this really fascinating. Again, I'm going to refer any of you interested in this kind of stuff to my friend Peterson Toscano's video. Again, this isn't definitive stuff. This is a read of this whole conversation, and his reading of Jacob as well as Joseph in that video, which is titled Transfigurations, Transgressing Gender in the Bible. His read of them in that video, I think is just delightfully eye-opening and pleasant. And it's just good stuff. Transfigurations, Transgressing Gender in the Bible. Yeah, good stuff. Okay. Why doesn't Joseph get more airtime in terms of the scholarship and in terms of the faith traditions? I don't know. But what I do know, right, is it because he spent so much time in Egypt and he has children of Egyptian descent? Right? I mean, raise your hand, if I were in a class right now, I'd be asking you all, raise your hand if you were aware that Ephraim and Manasseh are actually half Egyptian. Like, did you know that if you grew up in a faith community that talked about the tribes of Israel, and one of the tribes is split into Ephraim and Manasseh, right? They're the two sons of Joseph. So instead of Joseph being the head of a tribe, they split it. Essentially, they split a tribedom. But they're Egyptian, right? They're Joseph's children and also the children of an Egyptian woman. What I think is, this isn't even about like sex, marriage, and all the stuff I want to talk about, but I just think this is super fascinating because the storyline itself tells us that you know you're not supposed to, that these men weren't supposed to marry people outside of their people. They were supposed to take women from among their own people, right? You're not supposed to take women from among the Canaanites because those women might cause us to worship these other gods. And that was always the bottom line reason for it. It sounds xenophobic, but it's not as xenophobic as it actually sounds, because it's all about worshiping the right God. Okay, so there's that. But they're told over and over and over again, and it becomes a really big deal in the biblical storyline when people come back from the exile in Babylon, right? So in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, very big deal that men not be marrying foreign women, right? It's also more complex than that because their own women, the descendants of the people living in the land, have been intermarrying with Assyrians, for instance. So that's why you get this reference to the people of Samaria in a very negative way, why the reference to a Samaritan, the idea of a good Samaritan, is actually an oxymoron to people of Israel, which is why I think the story, the narrator in the Gospels actually has Jesus interact with a person from Samaria and say, actually, this guy's more just and holy than you all. Challenging the concept that a Samaritan can't be good by saying, actually, he can. And this 800-year-old grudge that you all are holding just needs to go the way of the dinosaurs. That'd be funny if they could say that in the Bible. Anyway, got lots of tangents going on that one. Sorry about that. Bring it back together here. Bring it back in. Bring it back in. So what are we talking about? So when I was looking through the rest of Genesis and what other stories are there that apply to the topics I've chosen, right? Talking about sex, the relationship we call marriage, and then physical harm and abuse involving personal, intimate body parts, right? There aren't really many stories left in Genesis that apply to that. So I was looking at Joseph's story, and I thought I'd look at very briefly with you this element of Joseph is the great grandson of Abraham, right? He's one of the sons of Jacob, who is back and forth sometimes in the same story. He's being called Jacob, and sometimes he's being called Israel after his name change. I don't want to make a big deal of that. I just think it's worth noting. It's very interesting. Not the important point today. So Joseph, one of the youngest sons of Jacob, is his favorite. Talked about that yesterday or 2 days ago, I guess. I think it's really interesting what the narrative does divulge to us if we look at it close enough, right? In terms of, why Joseph, okay, he's the child of Jacob's, his older life, but that's not it really. Okay, he's the first son of Rachel. That's kind of a big deal to Jacob. But there's also this other dynamic potentially going on in there, in terms of the way Joseph embodied, the way he was embodied and what he was about. And it makes me grin. It makes me giggle because he's such an important character in the Genesis storyline. And he is not, let's just say, the signals I'm getting from the storyline itself, the biblical narrator, the biblical storyline itself has given me some signals that he's not your traditional, stereotypical, like super hetero, testosterone-ly driven male. And he gets a quarter of the storyline in terms of the family. He does, Joseph. Why I'm grinning is what this could do for some people who are in these either Christian or Jewish faith communities. There's a character here. There's a patriarch to claim as LGBTQ, poster guy. are you dragon? Like, I just think it's fascinating. I think it's really fun and delightful. And it's something I don't see people talking about a whole lot. And I'm going to bring that up because I'm on a committee with the Society of Biblical Literature. I'm on the Gender, Sexuality, and the Bible committee, and just wonder if that's ever been a kind of people dive into that Joseph thing there. So I think that's fun. So that brings me back to wanting to look at briefly Joseph's storyline a little bit. Oh, I thank you all for your really kind comments in relation to in the chat right now. Okay, so let's get into story time proper, if you will. So, okay, so let me be very clear about one other thing. And this is another like tangential component, not relevant to sex and marriage and all this stuff, but it is important to me as a biblical scholar to highlight for you because I think it's really fascinating. Okay, when people talk about this promise that God gave to Abraham that to a certain swath of land and his descendants will outnumber the stars and all these things, right? You'll be a blessing to the nations and all this great stuff. And people keep pointing back to this swath of land is where the people like this land belongs to Abraham and his descendants. But what's interesting to me is when you look into, I know I've mentioned this in one of these videos this month, but if you didn't see it, and even if you did, you might not remember any of this. I don't expect you to remember everything that someone says that you watch. When you look at the theories about where the people of Israel came from, like if we want to posit some sort of historical reality somehow way back 3,800 years or 3,500 years ago, right? That there actually was a group of people vaguely referred to, collection of tribes vaguely referred to as the Israelites, right? If we want to just posit something there, and they have this claim to, God gave our ancestor Abraham these promises, and these are the promises we're hanging on to and we're passing on to our children. And it's that this land belongs to us. We will be a great nation, and be established as our own people so that we can be blessing to other nations. Like that's what that promise means. To be a blessing to the nations means you are established on your own. You are your own people. You're not being ruled over, under the thumb of another ruler, another empire, right? To be able to be a blessing to the nations means you are established as a country, people, something, whatever the label would have been at the time, okay? Not just a bunch of nomads wandering around, okay? So it's a promise for permanence and identity and security is what that is. But people like to talk about, well, where did these people that become the Israelites who are supposed to inherit this particular swath of land, where did they come from? And, there's there's debate about that, right? And only a very few biblical scholars, very ultra conservative fundamentalists will tell you that it's that this whole thing kind of evolved the way it's described in the biblical storyline, according to the books of Genesis and Exodus. And those two books in particular are rather problematic. Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua, they'll claim those storylines, say this is what happened, right? People developed, they migrated down to Egypt. By the end of Genesis, they have this need to be freed because they were enslaved. As immigrant foreign people coming into another country are often enslaved for their labor or exploited for their labor. This is a piece of this storyline that transcends time and space, right? It's happens around the globe to this day, right? People fleeing their homeland for more security end up being exploited and not being able to be as fully useful as they were in their home country. Just saying. So they end up in Egypt. They're enslaved. They need some release from oppression. God hears their cries, sends Moses, blah, blah, blah. And then the Joshua storyline is about conquering Canaan, right? Conquering the people, slaughtering town after town after town after town of people. Horrific, right? All in the name of God. God tells them to do it. Humorously, in my opinion, the very next book says they didn't actually do everything that was described in Joshua. So we have a really interesting challenge to this idea that the biblical storyline is consistent in itself. We have lots of those actually as we go along. But a really interesting one to play with is Joshua versus Judges, on where the people of Israel kind of came to acquire the land and occupy the land. How did that happen? Slaughtering everybody else, or settling in among everybody else and gradually taking over? Two different theories there, two different explanations for how they came to be in that particular part of the world and to be occupying that particular part of the world. And neither of those are actually backed up historically by archaeology, right? So the archaeological evidence says something more like the gradual emergence, which is the people of the land gradually came together in contrast to other people in the land. That's the one that is most historically reliable, archaeologically speaking, as well as in terms of when we look at what human movements and how things like this develop. It makes the most sense to say the gradual emergence. And part of why all of this matters, if you're tracking with me, if you're not tracking, if I feel like if it sounds like I'm too scattered, it's a bit scattered, but I hope you can kind of pick up the pieces I'm putting down, because they do kind of connect. And that is, when we look at historically, the people who become Israel really just kind of came from the people already living there. And they separated themselves from some of their neighbors in some particular kind of a way. And their ancestors, just several generations back, are from Egypt, or are from Assyria, or Syria, Mesopotamia, Libya, the Hittite region. That they're these people that become Israel. It's not like they're this, I don't want to sound, they represent the whole region. The people that become Israel actually represent the whole wide ancient Near Eastern region in terms of their heredity, their ancestors, and not even that many generations back. You find their reach and their connection to peoples all throughout the ancient Near East are found in these people. And that is what I love about when you look at the stories of Judah, which we looked at yesterday in Genesis 38. It says right there, he takes a woman from among the Canaanites. His wife, air quotes, the woman he takes, with whom he has 3 sons, right? She's a Canaanite. She's not from the people of Israel. She's not one of his kindred like they're supposed to be doing. And he has 3 sons with her. 2 of them died. And then he claims, because they are his sons, he has sex with Tamar, gets her pregnant, right? That whole story yesterday. So those 2 sons are his also. But Tamar, is also a woman from Canaan. She's not an Israelite. She's not from among the tribes. So Judah, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, has children with a Canaanite woman. So it is underscoring this reality that though there's stories saying don't do that, they're all doing it. They're all connecting with people from all over the place to produce these people that become the heads of the tribes of Israel, or their next generation down, right? And so Joseph, one of the 12 sons, has 2 children in Egypt, 2 sons. They are claimed, and they get to split one of the tribes, essentially. They're Egyptian boys, right? And they are like heads of the tribes of Israel. So this whole concept of, it's so much more diverse in terms of the people that make up the people of Israel to begin with, right? Their ancestry is very diverse. Am I making any sense? I don't know that I am. I'm trying to connect it to this issue of people thinking that there's this purity to the lineage, right? That it's and the connection to the land, and that this land belongs to the people here, but the people who live here represent the whole region. I'm going to let that go and move on to story time now, because if there was something in there that you connected with, great. It is time to do story time. So let me just do that. Let me do this. Okay, I think I can do it that way. All right. So I need to do a little something here. All right, we're going to do that. And I'm going to do this, make this smaller. There we go. So I can do both, because I'm not sure. I didn't go look for a Bible in the library. So I'm going to just read from chapter 41 of Genesis and look at part of Joseph's story here. So I'm in the section that's labeled Joseph's Rise to Power, starting in verse 38 of chapter 41. The proposal that Joseph made to Pharaoh in response to Pharaoh's dreams is what we're talking about. So the proposal pleased Pharaoh and all of his slaves. My English says servants. I think it's slaves. And Pharaoh said to his slaves, "Can we find anyone else like this, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Right? So he's claiming that Joseph is just fantastic, right? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has shown you all this, his ability to interpret the dreams, his ability to make sense of it all, and to plan for the future, because of the dreams about lean and fat, lean years and good years. Since God has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you." Some great things being said about Joseph here. "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only with regard to the throne will I be greater than you. You are literally going to be second in charge of all of Egypt." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." Removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command, and they cried out in front of him, "Bow the knee!" Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up a hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, I guess it's Potiphera, priest of On, as his woman, my English says wife. Thus Joseph gained authority over the land of Egypt. Okay, I am going to pause and say, I'm conflicted over all this, because it's a really amazing claim to be making about Joseph, one of Jacob's sons, to have this kind of a position of power in Egypt, to be so highly regarded and so easily welcoming, right? He had been enslaved and sold to Pharaoh, and then someone was able to see his abilities and bring him to the Pharaoh and allow his abilities, according to the storyline, to be taken advantage of in a positive way. So on one level, it's like, this is amazing. He's second in command of Egypt. Why isn't everybody celebrating this? And so the fact that people don't is fascinating to me. The flip side of my hesitation is it's a really interesting claim to be making in light of how things play out in a couple generations. So, it's like a bittersweet thing. I'm torn that more people don't celebrate Joseph, and we just talk about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Is it because Joseph had children in Egypt, and so we don't want to focus too much on these? I'm just saying. And then the other thing is, as someone said the other day, like I was commenting on Joseph's story, that he's enslaved, or he's in position of power, but he's under the Pharaoh, and Pharaoh's woman comes in and tries to seduce him several times, and he valiantly says no. And so someone commented that this is an interesting way of making Egypt look bad, that someone in Egypt is trying to seduce or force some form of interaction that is not consensual, right? I think that comment is valid, right? That this is an interesting way of demeaning Egypt. So which is it? Are we trying to demean Egypt and its power and its relative, because of its relative position to the Israelites? Or are we trying to say something else, like, the Israelites can infiltrate and rise to the second highest in command in Egypt? And, is that some sort of a slander on Egypt, that Israelites can take over, basically? I don't know that that's necessarily it, but I think there's an element going on here. I think these stories are really fascinating, and I think that politics are very much the driving force. Power, politics, influence, control, all of those things. And ultimately, this whole collection of scriptures is trying to create a narrative to endorse worshiping this one God, Yahweh, right? So I'm really conflicted over the whole thing, right? Because I'm trying to highlight these dynamics. Joseph is one of the youngest sons of Jacob. His own brothers hate him for various reasons, some perhaps good reasons, like he's kind of arrogant, but some perhaps what we would call homophobia and rejecting an effeminate brother. I really do think that's part of what's going on in that storyline. And so the fact that a man who doesn't embody the ideal masculinity goes to Egypt and rises to the top, there's this deep part of me that wants to just celebrate that. And that is a community, that's a culture that just didn't care about that stereotype of masculinity or something. And look what can happen, and his abilities and gifts are allowed to flourish. I don't think of this as historically accurate. I don't. I think that this is a narrative that tells us some really interesting things about the people at the time. And so I think I'm really just trying to bring your attention to some of these dynamics, maybe a bit of tension here in terms of what you've thought of it being, and perhaps what it is actually trying to show us. I don't know. So we have this thing. So Joseph is second in charge, and Pharaoh gives him, the daughter of a priest. And I didn't have a chance to look up the importance of O-N, and even, is that the region or is that the god? To be honest, I didn't get a chance to look that up. But she gives him 2 children. So I'm going to keep moving because that's where we're headed for this conversation. Joseph was 30. So verse 46 of chapter 41. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plenteous years, the earth produced abundantly. He gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt, and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. So Joseph stored up grain in such abundance, like the sand of the sea, that he stopped measuring it. It was beyond measure. The redundancy in this little passage just cracks me up. Before the years of famine came, Joseph had 2 sons. Joseph had 2 sons, right? Not Joseph's woman gave birth to 2 boys. Joseph had 2 sons. Miraculously, bing, there they are, whom Asenath, daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore to him. Thank you. Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, which comes from making to forget, the verb making to forget, right? So he said, "For God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." The second he named Ephraim, which comes from being fruitful. "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my misfortunes." So Ephraim and Manasseh. And then the 7 years of plenty ended, and then came the famine and all the stuff there. And I'm not as interested in that, even though it is interesting. It's not the main point for my story today. So we get through all that, and we get through the whole, I'm skipping over the whole interaction with his brothers. I find it interesting. It's a really powerful story in terms of forgiveness. I think it makes his brothers come out looking like a bunch of jerks who don't have genuine humility, or I don't read them as being genuinely sorry for how they treated their brother. And yet their brother rises to the occasion over and over, as goes, he goes high when they go low, if you will. I find it a really interesting story in terms of human potentially showing us an element of human nature, and that Joseph continuously just is a righteous person, I think, and chooses to do good, and even when his brothers apologize, it's not even a genuine apology. And yet he sees it as genuine and forgives them. I mean, it's just a really interesting story. But that's not what I'm most interested in for this series. I'm now looking at, after all of that goes down, and I'm looking in chapter 48 of Genesis. After this, Joseph was told, so after his interactions with his brothers and forgiving them and blah, 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 Joseph, we're still dealing with Joseph, was told, your father is ill. So he took with him his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, Manasseh being the older of the two. When Jacob was told, your son Joseph has come to you, Jacob summoned his strength and sat up in bed and said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan, and he blessed me and said to me, I'm going to make you fruitful and increase your numbers. I will make of you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your offspring after you for a perpetual holding. Each of these first three generations of men apparently received this visitation from God and this promise and message from God: Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Therefore, so now Jacob is speaking to Joseph. Therefore, your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt. I love that language, right? These two sons were born to you. I know I've pointed this out before, and I'm pointing it out again for the very same reason. Over and over and over, the women are essential, but are not even given a nod. These sons were miraculously born to you. I know it's the way they thought, and that's my point, is that way of thinking continues to this day to a certain degree, because we have so many ways of talking about families that only focus on the men. Back to the story. Therefore, your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, so before everybody came, escaping the famine in Canaan, right? Before all that, those two sons are now mine. Jacob is claiming his grandsons as his sons. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, just as Reuben and Simeon are, the first two born to him. Listen to me using their language. Born to him. The first two that Leah gave birth to, giving to him. But that's also kind of my point, isn't it? Like, I literally just repeated the language they're using, and I'm intentionally trying to challenge it. But I've just been reading it for a couple weeks, and I'm already it's already coming out of me without even thinking about it. Think about how that then is played out over a person's lifetime and over centuries of faith communities perpetuating and passing down the ideas. Just a point I'm trying to make. As for the offspring born to you, Joseph, after them, they shall be yours. I find this fascinating, and I don't need to dissect it, but they shall be recorded under the names of their brothers with regard to their inheritance. For when I came from Paddan, Rachel, alas, died in the land of Canaan on the way, while there was still some distance to go to Ephrath, and I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, so, before it was Jacob, and now in verse 8, it's Israel. So do we have two versions of the same encounter between Jacob and Joseph over Joseph's sons? Do we, that are just being pasted together? Potentially, yes. But I'm going to keep reading as if it's all one story, because that's how it's here for us. But it's worth us paying attention to, right? Anyway, so when Israel saw Joseph's sons, who are these? So Joseph said, these are my sons whom God has given me here in Egypt. And he said, bring them to me, please, that I may bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim with age, and he could not see well. I love the way they do this so many times. They define the word for you in context. It's just nice of them. So Joseph brought them near him, and he kissed them and embraced them. Israel said to Joseph, I did not expect to see your face, and here God has let me see your children also. Then Joseph removed them from his father's knees. I wanted to comment on this. This was one of the reasons I wanted to read this. Someone had asked, what's this deal of referencing having children on your knees? And I don't know the full answer, but I know that it's an innocent thing. It's Joseph removed them from his father's knees. It's a way of saying they're being claimed by him. He's claiming these children, right? Sitting them on his lap kind of a thing, and just being embraced or something into the family. And that's what we saw Sarah saying, that she, that Hagar would have a child and she could have, bring them into her own family. The same happens, with Rachel and Leah having children on their own knees using Bilhah and Zilpah. And here it is again. Joseph removed them from his father's knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left, and Manasseh in his left hand towards Israel's right. So the scene is Joseph wants his older son to be blessed first, as the older son, getting the blessing, all that stuff. But Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it on the head of Ephraim instead, who was younger, and his left hand he laid on Manasseh, crossing his hands, for Manasseh was the firstborn. He blessed Joseph and said, the God before whom my ancestors Abraham and Isaac walked, not Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, but Abraham and Isaac, very patriarchal. The God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all harm, bless the boys. And in them let my name be perpetuated, and the name of my ancestors Abraham and Isaac, not Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah, and let them grow into a multitude on the earth. When Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him. So he took his father's hand and removed it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said, Father, not so. Since this one is the firstborn, put your right hand on his head. But his father said, No, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. Nevertheless, his younger brother shall be greater than he. I mean, you're literally talking about the younger of the two sons who ended up with the inheritance, right? Jacob. And his offspring shall become a multitude of nations. So he blessed them both, right? He blessed them that day, saying, by you, Israel will invoke blessings, saying, God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, so Jacob or Israel, same guy, said to Joseph, I am about to die, but God will be with you and will bring you again to the land of your ancestors. I now give to you one portion more than to your brothers, the portion that I took from the hand of the Amorites with my sword and with my bow. Such a weird thing to say at the very end of this whole thing. Anyway, they are in Egypt. Everybody's dying in Egypt. The next chapter or so has Joseph making his brothers promise that when Joseph dies, that they do finally leave the land, that they will take Joseph's bones with them back to Canaan so he can be buried there. And they do. They honor that promise. So what does this have to say about marriage and sex and all those things? Not a whole lot, but it is saying some interesting things to us about how families talk about tell their stories, tell their lineage. It's all about the men, even when you can't have the lineage without the women. We're only naming the men. It's the women are being forced to be a part of this whole thing, and we're only talking about the God of the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're not talking about the God of our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. We're not saying it that way. We're just focusing on the men. So goodness gracious, give the Southern Baptist Convention, whatever it is, a break, because their scriptures teach them to focus on the men. I'm just saying. I'm not actually interested in giving the SBC a pass, but I do think it's interesting that the scriptures of both of these traditions do teach people to be very patriarchal. It is only in being able to separate yourself from what these scriptures teach you that people are able to be humane. It is only in being able to separate yourself from what it is saying, which is focus on the men. You have to be more evolved than these scriptures in order to be able to say men and women are equals. The scriptures of the faith traditions teach you to be patriarchal. Traditions, faith traditions that are true to their scriptures, true to the scriptures of the Christian tradition or the Jewish tradition, ought to be very patriarchal and not egalitarian between men and women. You have to evolve beyond depending on these scriptures. You have to evolve to the point where you're able to say, I understand that these are ancient texts and they reflect what these ancient people thought, not what God, whatever God actually is declaring for all time. So you actually have to have a fairly I want to say mature, but it's really just you need to have an understanding of what these texts are, that the Christian tradition in particular has worked pretty hard the last several hundred years to keep people from understanding about their own scriptures. So yeah, I think it's all awful. I think it's awful the way it teaches a focus on the men as important, teaches that women are not fully human. It does. They do that. And so you do need to be aware of what the Bible is and is not. And, I spend a lot of time thinking about what am I going to say today and what kinds of things do I want to highlight whatever passage I'm reading today. And I was listening to NPR as I was fixing my lunch today to take with me. And, I was listening to this piece on talking about legislation in this country related to women's having autonomy over their own bodies. And, someone was saying, we're still treating women as subhuman in this legislation, This is still treating women as not fully human. Women are, and there's a connection here, folks. There's a connection between these ancient texts that people are reared reading and hearing from. You grow up in a faith community that holds on to these collections as sacred without being given the tools to critically assess what it is and is not. So I always want to have some compassion for people who are still very patriarchally minded, whether in their family relationships, the way they treat people socially, the way they think about legislation. Like, I want to be very compassionate about that because I understand why they think that way. And so this is my effort to do whatever I can to contribute to. It's important to understand why people think this way, and it's important then to be able to offer some sort of insights into how you get beyond thinking that way. As a biblical scholar who has taught in many classrooms over the years and in various parts of this country, the United States, from the South to the Northwest, and in Texas, I don't know where Texas falls in that, the Southeast to Texas to Northwest. Like, it's really important to be able to invite people in to be honest, to give them a space to be honest about what they think the Bible is, and then give them the tools to say, I understand that you think it is utterly inspired by God, that whole 2 Timothy 3:16 thing. But that's not really what it is. So let's talk about what it actually is and is not, and then we can move through each of the steps about how to unpack what you've been taught and replace that with something more realistic. It doesn't mean you have to kick the Bible to the curb. It just means you need to have a better understanding of how to engage it. And so that's the work I'm trying to do here. That's the work I'm doing in my book, Permission Granted, Take the Bible into Your Own Hands. It's the work I'm doing in the book that's coming out soon, Marriage in the Bible, What Do the Texts Say? It's the work I'm doing in this series of walking through the stories in Genesis. And so we have a few more days left in June. So I'm going to move on to another book. I haven't decided which one. It might be Judges, it might be Joshua, it might be just random stories that are just interesting moving through. I'm not sure. But I'm going to keep going, obviously, through the month of June and then perhaps beyond June. We'll see. That's what I'm interested in doing. That's what I'm trying to do, is inviting people to have a deeper understanding about what the texts are actually doing, what they're about in their own context first, and then figure out how to handle that if it's important to you and your faith community to still engage these texts on some level. This is how you can do it without throwing your intellect out the window. You can engage these scriptures still to fruitful ends, I think, today. That's also what I have a podcast called Wild Olive, game-changing conversation about literature, culture, and the Bible. I read biblical texts with a literature professor, and we talk about how this poetry that we're reading helps us better understand the scriptures, and the scripture story itself also helps enliven and give meaning to the poetry. But that there's something very human in that connection in this poetry, but also it helps us see the humanity in the passages from the Bible that the poets are drawing upon. So there are ways. Part of the point I'm trying to make here is there are ways beyond throwing the Bible out entirely and seeing it as literally historical and verbatim what God intended. Those are two crazy extremes, and there are places in between that are actually really productive. And I'm interested in being somewhere in the middle so that people can have a conversation. People can actually get to a place where they don't have to, if the Bible's important, and they don't have to throw it out, but they can have a reasoned, intelligent, critical thinking engagement with it. That's what I'm trying to do. And as an ally, yes, I have written a book about marriage in the Bible and what the texts actually do say about marriage in the Bible. So, questions? So someone just said it's impossible. Let me put this up here. It's impossible for me to talk to a Christian without kicking the Bible. I think that says to the curb. I don't like being lied to and learning about it. It's way. I think I understand what you're getting at there. Where can you access my podcast? You can get to my podcast through any place where you get podcasts, iTunes, Google, anywhere. There are 12 different ways that I can see people are accessing our, like at least 12 different ways people are accessing our podcast. So anywhere you go for podcasts. Wild Olive is the name, and Gene Patrol, and let me do this. I'm trying to think which way I can do this. Can I share my screen without, oops. Let's see. I'm not sure the best way to do that. Can I share my screen without doing that? Yeah, Wild Olive, my name, and then Gene Patrol, JeAnne Petrolle. You should be able to pull it up. Yeah. It is fun. It is a very fun podcast. We do a lot of laughing. And I appreciate you all being here. I am just delighted. There have been people here today. I feel like this wasn't my best day, but we're touching on some important stuff. It's not maybe as juicy as some days, but it's still important, I think, because I'm very committed to having a better understanding of what the Bible is and is not. And that's what chapter 1 of my book, Permission Granted, is titled, What the Bible Is and Is Not. And chapters 2 and 3 are about the garden story, and chapter 4 is about sex, who, what, and why. And so I think that if you're interested in more that you can just kind of wrap your head around, Permission Granted, Take the Bible into Your Own Hands, my second book, is also a good place for you to find some additional helpful input or scholarship, actually, in this process or this conversation. So thank you for being here. I hope that if you've been here live, or if you're watching this on later, I hope there's been something useful for you. Sorry that the sound has been a little quieter today, given my location, and I hope it's been productive. And thanks for being here. We will move on beyond the book of Genesis tomorrow. Just haven't decided what that will be. So I'll try to create the link by around 2:00, so it's there if you want to get here early and hang out and chat like some people like to do. So thanks for being here. See you next time.